Good evening, 9:30 p.m. here in the East, 6:30 p.m. on the West Coast. And tonight, American voters decide the direction of their nation. We have had some major poll closings and some major posted projected victories for the Democrats, especially in the U.S. Senate. We begin in the state of Pennsylvania. The son of the former governor there, Casey, will be the next U.S. senator from there, sending away the incumbent Senator Santorum. In Ohio, Congressman Sherrod Brown has defeated the incumbent Mike DeWine. A big race here now in the state of Maryland, where in the past 30 minutes, Congressman Ben Cardin has turned away the interest by Steele, his competitor. This race we've been watching for a long time, big money, high interest race. Ditto in the state of New Jersey, where Bob Menendez, Democrat from the House of Representatives, has turned away Tom Kean, the son of the governor of the same name. An independent in the U.S. Senate from Connecticut. You last knew him as Democrat Joe Lieberman, turned away by his own primary, came back as a third-party candidate. Iraq, a big issue in that race. The governor of Michigan, Stabenow, elected overwhelmingly tonight. Virginia, the Senate race there is too close, too early to call that race. Allen versus Webb, you see the numbers in at this hour. Lincoln Chafee, son of John Chafee in Rhode Island, the moderate Republican, trying to hang on to his job tonight. This race in New England, also too early to call. Out west, a race we'll be watching tonight, John Kyle, Republican, trying to hang on. Again, too early to call. Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton spent a fortune, cruised to victory here in the state of New York. Bob Byrd, age 89, begins term number 9, representing the state of West Virginia. Richard Lugar cruises in Indiana, where, incidentally, 2 Republican members of Congress have gone down to the Democrats tonight from Indiana. In Massachusetts, Ted Kennedy, another term for the liberal senator from the Commonwealth. In Vermont, the vacant seat will be filled by the independent Sanders, who sits with the Democrats when they caucus. In Ohio, the Democrats pick up a governor. Strickland is the victor in Ohio. And in Massachusetts, the second ever black governor in United States history, Deval Patrick. Also in the state of Maryland, just in the time we have been on the air, former mayor of Baltimore, Martin O'Malley, the governor in the state of Maryland. And I've been told we now have a called in Rhode Island. Sheldon Whitehouse is going to defeat the incumbent Lincoln Chafee, who inherited the family Senate seat, you might say. Lincoln Chafee seemed a bit mystified that as a moderate, someone who had reached across the aisle before, he...
Let me also acknowledge the
Claire
tens of
McCaskill
thousands
claims victory in Missouri. We now have another category. We've had projected winners, apparent winners. Now we have another self-announced before the other guys conceded winner. First Jim Webb and now Claire McCaskill. There's no concession from the Republican incumbent in either of these.
Once upon a time, there was a protocol. The candidate who was losing would concede defeat, make the phone call to the candidate who had won, and congratulate him or her. At which point the candidate would say, "Thank you for your magnanimity," and proceed to the hall and accept victory. In Virginia tonight, we have no indication whatever that George Allen called up Jim Webb and said, "I've lost to you." He certainly didn't tell his troops that. So Webb proceeded unilaterally to declare victory. We just missed it here, but he did it. In this case, the same with Claire McCaskill. She declared victory. We haven't seen anything from Jim Talent to suggest he's given up. So once again, as politics deteriorates in this country, an old, wonderful rule has gone by, which is you let your opponent who's losing say so first.
This does beg the question, though, of what happens if either of them, especially Claire McCaskill, would be wrong. I mean, obviously, the Virginia thing is going to be recounted one way or the other. It's going to, and let's put it this way, it's going to carry over into tomorrow morning.
Right.
We know that much. But is this, if you get this wrong, what happens? I mean, there's
I don't know.
It's like
the old famous Chicago Tribune headline that Dewey had won in '48, but that was a joke. It was a failure of, they jumped ahead of the news. Here you have the candidates jumping ahead of the news, and I guess you just save that as a joke for the next party fundraisers of the other party. You've got a candidate claiming he'd won or she'd won and lost.
Well, maybe we're looking at the wrong end of the telescope here, though, because with the Webb claim of victory in Virginia and the McCaskill claim of victory in Missouri, we're down to one Senate seat that decides who controls the Senate, and it's Conrad Burns versus crew-cut John
that
Tester.
brings us to the latest numbers, and here we are. John Tester, Democrat. According to these raw numbers, it was 64% of the votes counted, 124,000 to 115,000 roughly, a narrow advantage, but a significant advantage. It's enough to win, obviously, tonight in these close races. That won't be a recount situation. These are small states. This is a small state, Montana. So you are right, sir. Keith, if Montana goes, Missouri goes, Virginia goes, that's 3 plus 3, they go. They win.
It could be as Montana goes, so goes the nation. Well, does that not segue us perfectly into our next three guests? Brian Williams of NBC Nightly News, Tom Brokaw, anchor emeritus of NBC Nightly News and something of an expert on the region, and of course Tim Russert, NBC Washington bureau chief and moderator of Meet the Press. And Tom, let's start with you. As Montana goes, so goes the nation, perhaps?
That could very well be the case in the Montana Senate race. I'd like to know what counties are still out. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the topography of Montana, Yellowstone County is Billings, the biggest town. That's Conrad Burns territory. Conventionally, the Tester people thought they were doing pretty well there. Gallatin County is over where Brian Williams likes to run around a dirt track in a fast car, and that's Bozeman. Those two counties are big movers and shakers in Montana politics, so we'll see what happens. It's going to take about 240,000 votes to win this, probably, because they always get a very high voter turnout. Everybody expected it to be very close. The Tester people thought that they had closed quickly yesterday and were doing well, and the exit polling shows that Tester was doing well among males and females, better than Conrad Burns. That should be a strong indication for him, but this one is up for grabs.
Tim, give us your read on this, the extraordinary scenario of this campaign, and the Conrad Burns might be the first senator ever defeated by the YouTube website. Is that in prospect now, serious prospect?
Absolutely. It is not only the things that he said, but also his relationship with Jack Abramoff, the now convicted lobbyist from Washington. Keith, the irony in all this, of course, is if Conrad Burns loses and the Democrats recapture control of the Senate for the first time since 1994, the new chairman of the Senate Finance Committee will be Democrat Max Baucus of Montana. So he who giveth taketh away, and vice versa. It is quite striking as we sit here now at 2 o'clock in the morning, contemplating the real possibility that the Democrats could get this trifecta, Missouri, Virginia, and Montana, and control both houses of Congress for the first time since 1994 and the Republican Revolution of Newt Gingrich.
But Brian Williams, what happened with the protocol that Chris was just talking about? Where are the alternative points of view from Missouri? We already heard one from Virginia. What happened to that idea that gee whiz, you let the person who you think lost go first?
Well, that's the thing. You know, Frank Capra doesn't write these, and Frank Capra never wrote a script where at the end lawyers come in. And they come in on Gulfstream 4s with beautiful shoes and briefcases. So a lot of this isn't going to go according to Hoyle. There were so many scenarios tonight. Who had it that at the end of the night, who predicted it, of all the people in the blogosphere, print journalists, that we'd be down to this kind of Republican firewall has become the term du jour to describe this protection. All that remains between Republican and Democratic control of the U.S. Senate. What a storyline tonight.
And Tim, Brian just used the term firewall relative to the Montana race, which might in fact be decided by how Conrad Burns, in some part anyway, Conrad Burns characterized visiting firefighters. The ironies just pile upon each other.
And on and on and on. And think about Missouri, Keith, and what is deciding that? Stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research, huge role. Michael J. Fox and Rush Limbaugh, a native son of Missouri. Yep. And think about Virginia in McCaskill by George Allen. It is fascinating how these moments during this campaign may have, in fact, shaped the outcome of history if, in fact, the Senate flips.
Let me ask you all, were you all as taken as I was by the really classy, to use a Sinatra term, a classy concession by Harold Ford Jr. tonight? Hey. I was, and it wasn't exactly a full confession. It was, I lost this race, but I'm coming back.
Chris, I'll go first because I snuck a listen. I have a little, I can listen in one ear. I have this little device I put up to my ear. It looks like I'm going to call Thelma Lou in Mayberry, but it works very well. And I did hear some of that speech. I heard the part exactly where he talked about getting Potomac fever at the ripe old age of 4 and how that district, in his words, took a chance on him at 25. We just went down there last week, spent some time with him. We got some flack, of course, for locating the broadcast in the largest city in Tennessee, which, oh, by the way, is Harold Ford's political center. We did it, of course, not for reasons of bias or to throw the broadcast in his direction. The report we aired was completely balanced, but it was, as speeches went tonight, one of the more interesting, and I'll say nothing beyond that.
Tim, did you hear the open door there to another race, perhaps for the other Senate seat at some point?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's an interesting piece of this story tonight. Although Harold Ford Jr. did not win, although Michael Steele and Maryland didn't win, was the emergence of these extraordinarily competent and attractive African-American candidates of both parties, coupled with the emergence of Barack Obama as a very credible presidential candidate. And so it's an important change and advancement and evolution in our politics, and one I think we'll remember in 2006.
I thought it was great, just as an observer and as an American, to see that the polling in Tennessee turned out to be pretty predictive. Unlike in the case of the Doug Wilder race, where we had an African-American predicted by polls to be 13 points ahead in that Virginia governor's race and winning by 1. The 2 times to Tom Bradley, the police commissioner of Los Angeles, losing races he was predicted by the pollsters to win. This time, people were at least true to themselves. They voted the way that they talked to the pollsters. They weren't playing any games out there. I assume the white voters were speaking the way to the pollsters they intended to vote, and they were faithful to their own account of how they're going to vote. That is some progress, I think.
Well,
sure
Chris, it's also very generational, obviously. I mean, the 2 cases that you cite, Doug Wilder and Tom Bradley, we're counting on voters who were already mature by the time the civil rights vote was taken. You now have a whole generation of voters who have grown up with a much more integrated society, and they see on television commercials and work for African Americans, men and women in the workplace, and see them in a whole different role models. So I think that is part of the rising tide. By the way, I was surprised to hear that. I thought this was a defibrillator in case I went down with a heart attack.
Well, that was good news. I think all of us agree. I think it's like, in the words of George Jefferson, and the Jeffersons were all moving a little on up here. But, Tim, you know, you talked about all those opportunities that the party, mainly the Republican Party, have given to African Americans, but nobody won. Here it comes. We have news right now. Let's take a look right now. I think we may have a card coming up here right now.
Okay.
Claire McCaskill, here it is. NBC News projects when all the votes are counted in the state of Missouri that the winner will be Claire McCaskill, the Democratic challenger, defeating a very strong, resistance, defiant re-election campaign by Jim Towne, a man who had no, as someone said, had no firing offenses this year, did nothing wrong, had no severe constituency problems like Rick Santorum had in Pennsylvania, and nonetheless went down before this wave.
And Jim Towne has just conceded this, so this is more than just a projection here. This is also now the Republican Party.
We're getting it done somewhat out of order right now. Tim?
Well, now it's there. Then there were 2, Montana and Virginia. And if, in fact, those trends hold, you could decide the fate of the United States Senate with 3,000 voters from the state of Virginia out of more than 2 million cast. This is extraordinary. But it really does give an awful lot of credence to that notion that vote turnout really does matter. And all that energy and all that money and all those attempts to try to galvanize the support clearly is being reflected tonight. It really is important, as we could see in the next a couple hours.
It's quite a recruitment effort by Chuck Schumer, I must say. Chuck went out and found, the senator from New York, chairman of the campaign committee, went out and found an interesting group of people, a pro-choice man from a beloved family in Pennsylvania, Bobby Casey Jr. He found a man of tremendous military accomplishment and commendability, Jim Webb in Virginia, a man right out of the military, almost a John Warner type, another former Secretary of the Navy. And then he found a guy with a crew cut up in Montana, Tom. I wonder if Chuck Schumer's going to be on the lookout for more guys with those flat tops.
I think that Chuck Schumer deserves a lot of credit. I'm not sure that in the Webb and in the Tester case that he gets all the credit for that. There was some resistance to the idea. You remember Webb had a primary, and
that's true.
And the party leaders were divided about whether Webb was the right guy.
So did Tester.
And so did Tester have a primary. And in fact, he was thought not to be the strongest candidate going in. But Schumer did a phenomenal job of raising money and getting around the country, as he always does. He lives and breathes this stuff. So this was a clash of titans. Karl Rove against Schumer and Rahm Emanuel.
Hey, Chris and Keith, I just had a thought, though. If, in fact, Tester and Webb both win, and it's 51-49, what happens if Joe Lieberman said, you know what?
Oh, boy.
Maybe I really am going to align myself with the other party and become chairman. No, I'm just kidding, but it's something to think about.
And Chris, one final thought. Look, Chris,
it would be so much like Joe Lieberman, too. I'm sorry.
Chris,
Brian.
One final thought to look for the official coronation in the media this coming week of Rahm Emanuel. He's the subject of a long takeout in the current issue of Fortune magazine. Goes into great detail on his family, the infection that robbed him of most of a digit, his years in the Israeli Defense Forces, his years as a ballet student. He is going to be really lionized, I think, for the effort he put in on the House side for the Democratic Party. So there will be, if you're a profile writer, television correspondent in Washington, these will be happy days, no shortage of work.
I called him up last week and I said, okay, what's the number going to be? And he said 26. And I think that's how far he had gotten. But I really do think something ballooned over the weekend. Something drove this much higher than that number. And it was a hard one to kind of figure when it got late. Hard to figure this one.
Yeah, one of the worst developments from this cycle will be the new robocalls. They had the most corrosive effect on the American household. Most people have an arm's length relationship with campaigning. You can toss the direct mail, you can turn off or mute the television. But when your phone rings 7 to 8 times, because it's been programmed to ring if it is hung up before it reaches 30 seconds, and it turns out to be all for a purpose of slamming a specific candidate or party, that's, as they said in The Godfather, a dirty business. And people will draw the line there. It's a tough thing to get your arms around and legislate, but that has angered a lot of people this session.
Thanks a lot, Brian Williams. Tim Russert and Tom Brokaw. You know, it's interesting that tonight we're reporting on all the results, and the only one who has shown in that entire presidential field is Hillary and McCain. John Edwards not to be heard from tonight, nowhere out there. Mitt Romney not to be heard from tonight. Rudy Giuliani, I didn't see him tonight. Where are all those people? They didn't play a big role in tonight's election night. They were out in the field. They didn't make a point to show up tonight. I found it interesting.
Well, the whole 2008 field and what is to be expected from it has changed tonight, because we're not going into the end of an 8-year one-party rule in Washington. Now it's a totally different playing field. Who will emerge? Who are the Democrats' leaders now that they have at least the House and maybe the Senate as well? How will that change their dynamic? And what kind of hamstringing of the president, of a Republican president, will there be, and how would that trail over into the next Republican candidate?
I got a new one for you, Keith. Yeah? If the Democrats win those 2 other Senate seats and the requisite number to take control in the U.S. Senate, there is a prize waiting for a Democrat to be majority leader of the U.S. Senate, a prize that wasn't available a day ago, a prize perhaps Hillary Clinton would like. She has an option now. she doesn't have to run for president. She can be the leader of her party in the Congress. That's not a bad role for someone in their second term. Not a bad role for someone who would have to risk all to run for president, but would have it all right now if she cuts a deal, as we've heard so often, is available to her with Harry Reid, and take control of the Senate.
As you suggest, the entire playing field will change, not just in terms of the next 2 years, but as 2008 approaches, and who runs, who doesn't, and what is available to them now. What is the power now sufficient for the aspirations of these individual Democrats?
Well, I believe we'll have our first woman president when she can be the leader of a parliament first, rather than have to run as an individual in a kind of a John Wayne commander-in-chief role. Therefore, Hillary can become leader of this country if she becomes leader of the Senate, and people get used to her as the leader of a party, in effect leader of the country and its legislative branch. Over time, they'll get used to the idea of her as president. To just quit the legislative branch without having become a leader and taking yourself before the American people and say, make me your leader, that is a big jump in history.
Well, with Senator-elect McCaskill in Missouri, we now have 16 women in the Senate. And speaking, we are now down, probably, at least from the Democratic point of view, we're down to Montana, and we may get a call on that. The governor of that state saying Tester Burns will be called in the next half hour. A spokesman for Conrad Burns' campaign saying the race is definitely tightening, admitting that the Democratic challenger, John Tester, is leading in Yellowstone County. The Republicans have to win that to win statewide. It may come down to Yellowstone County in Montana to determine if the Democrats take the Senate as well as the House. That is what we're going to be following after this next break, Chris. It's
you got to get out your map quest.
Well, it's good enough. It's now one thing to look at least.
Who would have believed it would go this far? It looks like it's going to be in the high 230s for the Republican seats in the House, and maybe 51 seats in the Senate, enough to overrule Vice President Cheney no matter how hard he tries.
Unless Joe Lieberman agrees with him. Remember,
will you stop? You are fishing in troubled waters here. Joe Lieberman says he will be a Democrat.
Russert agreed with me on that point. Well, anyway, we're going to look at Montana. We're going to keep our eye on that ball when we continue. Decision 2006 continues here on MSNBC. Please stay with us.
MSNBC. Keith Olbermann's special comment. One thing is certain. When Keith talks, people listen. Only on Countdown. Only on MSNBC.
Chris, don't you think if Montana goes Democratic after Missouri went Democratic and it's now Virginia and a possible recount, that if they have to pay, no matter what they have to pay, doesn't the Republican Party have to go in for a recount in Virginia no matter what happens here, even if it doesn't look likely?
I also think, people who have committed themselves to the big time in politics, like George Allen, are not going to get down easy. I mean, his whole plan was to be president within a couple of years. He and his wife, I think, were headed for the big time, and they had a very good shot, because if they'd gotten past this election clean, which they have not done that, they would have found themselves in a very short list of Republican. John McCain has to think about whether he's going to run for president. Rudy Giuliani has not decided to run. Mitt Romney will run. George Allen had a good shot against Mitt Romney and the others, and I think it's easy to say, throw in the towel, but when your whole career goes between you're finished and you might be president someday, although I have to say now, after this very ragged campaign, I don't think George Allen's presidential material right now. You'd have to hope that people would forget this whole mess he went through with the macaque and the rest of it. They're not likely to do that. But I think that, it's very hard to quit. I will go back to this. I am so impressed by young Harold Ford Jr.'s ability to take it. And maybe being young allows him to take it because he knows intuitively at 36 he can come back another couple of times and go after Lamar Alexander when he comes up for re-election, or hope that he will retire. He has a good shot at the future right now.
Let's go back to Missouri, where Claire McCaskill's evident victory, certainly evident both from the projections, from all the numbers that are there, from the concession of the incumbent senator.
She won.
Jim Talent. She'll be going to the Senate from Missouri. Congratulations. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you.
I would think people nationally know this campaign based on that Michael J. Fox commercial and the subsequent extraordinary reaction, overreaction to it in many quarters. Do you think that was pivotal in this, or was it just a component in what happened for you in Missouri today?
it was just one piece of the campaign. The national media certainly made a lot of it, but here on the ground, it was more about Iraq. It was about change. It was about accountability and health care. I will say this, though. Rush Limbaugh's reaction to the Michael J. Fox ad certainly helped raise me a lot of money, and I'm very grateful to him for that.
Well, there's an old rule I'd like to coin in politics. Don't pick on somebody your size, pick on somebody bigger than you. Picking on Rush Limbaugh, just like you pick on Bill O'Reilly all the time, it's a pretty good strategy. You pick on somebody that has a lot of fans, obviously, but also a lot of critics. That does drum up interest in you.
Well, I think the whole thing did raise the profile of the race, but
it's great to have you on. Congratulations, Claire McCaskill. You've beaten a guy who had no firing offenses. You still beat him. You picked the race and you won it. Congratulations. In the middle of the country, Missouri has turned Democratic. Keith, that is the bellwether state.
Yeah, and we heard the Baker Commission referenced again as the possible.
Again, as we heard it from Rahm Emanuel earlier.
The face-saving mechanism to get us collectively, this country, out of the mess of Iraq. And there it was from the, what do we call, for the presumptive senator-elect? Is that the technical term right now?
The lady who just claimed victory.
Yeah, that's right. That's her. And I'm just thinking, as we've been going through all the math, for some reason, Karl Rove's words come to mind here about you are entitled to your math, and I'm entitled to the math.
I don't know what that means.
It's the new math tonight.
I'm impressed. What a nice person she seems to be, and she won. The race wasn't that dirty. Some of the others were dirtier, I can tell you, watching them across the country. And the president's got to deal with that. What we just heard, a confident person with the mandate of the people behind her in the swing state of the union, the president can't ignore that.
And now the swing state in the union is Montana. Nora.
Are extremely optimistic, and in fact, a spokesperson for John Tester, the Democrat, said, "I think we've got this one." Presumably could try and work out some sort of power sharing arrangement. So it's an interesting scenario, really, either way.
Now, it's interesting how Joe Lieberman's going to identify. I believe, although he's elected as an independent, I believe he's going to try to win full admission to the caucus, whereas the other fellow, Bernie Sanders, takes pride in being an independent, a self-described socialist, in fact. He likes being out there on his own.
Is the Lieberman thing going to be like the end of Moby Dick, where the seas consume what has happened during this year, and there's no sign of any discord. There's nothing left but Ishmael to tell the tale.
And interestingly enough, Keith, already today, before they declared Senator Joe Lieberman the winner in Connecticut as an independent, there was talk up on Capitol Hill among the Democrats that they were going to try and deny Joe Lieberman, if they won the majority, the chairmanship of which committee is it? John
Homeland
Horowitz,
Security.
with me? Yeah. No, not Arms. House Government Reform and Oversight. House Government Reform and Oversights.
It's not going to happen, Nora. I mean, if we have the Senate, Democrats have the Senate 51-49, we're not going to get rid of the guy who could then go over to the other side, and they would control the Senate again. So I think what's going to happen is Keith is exactly right. The waves are going to wash it away. He's going to be welcomed back into the Democratic Party.
Right, because in Washington, everything's always hunky-dory.
Oh, Keith.
Hey, Chris.
I've got to turn it over to Keith. Some voice got in my ear and said, turn it over to Keith. So,
right.
Keith.
But when have you listened to the voices?
I try to observe the choreography of this discussion.
Look,
as much as possible.
what do we got right now? We've got a Republican administration. We've got a Democratic House. We've got what looks like what could still be an absolute flat-footed tie in the Senate. We've got you listening to the voices in your ear.
And we have the Democratic Party. Every conversation we've had tonight, we've been successful. John, let me make a point, and then I'll throw it to you. It seems to me that all the interviews tonight add up to a couple of themes. They aren't just the president's quite comfortable where he stands, even with the loss of the Senate, I bet. So it's going to be interesting to see if the president does say, okay, I'll listen to Jimmy Baker and Lee Hamilton, and I might go along with some of their program, their proposal. But the Democrats don't yet this moment, as of tonight, have the fiber to offer a clear-cut alternative to this president. It's so obvious.
But when you interviewed Ken Mellman, did you not hear a hand coming out a little bit from outside the sleeve, some sort of gesture there, at least in tone that suggested there was somebody who's going to negotiate?
To elicit that, to seduce that, if you will, by saying, how can you have a political settlement in Iraq under our governance and our sponsorship if we don't have a political settlement here in the United States first? And he kept claiming his lack of competence in that area that he couldn't negotiate such a question. But in fact, it is a political question here at home. There has to be a political solution here before there.
So it is now a question of who is, and again, we used this before, the race towards bipartisanship. Who makes that first formal gesture? And I don't, I'm sorry, I can't imagine that the scheduling of those news conferences, Nancy Pelosi, 9 hours from now, and then the president 10 hours from now. I don't know that that's coincidental. It may be a race to be who can be the nicest
Keith,
first.
I have to tell you, this has been fun tonight. In a bipartisan sense.
In a bipartisan sense.
I listen to your commentaries. I get the point of view that you offer up after all the newscasts each night, and I find it very bracing and provocative. Word. How's that for a non-controversial?
You're sounding like a Democratic candidate tonight.
No, I find your views very informative in the tradition of Eric Severide, although you are not, as a bartender friend of mine once said, an Eric several sides. You have one clear side, and I think that's informative, and I think in all the world we work in, it's always good to have a provocation because it makes people think. And you are as good as Edward R. Murrow at that sort of thing, and I appreciate it. You are a great writer, a great partner tonight. We've never done this before. It was fun doing this with you, but we're going to take a long time, I think at least a couple of weeks, to absorb what happened tonight. I think this was a strong, powerful bombardment of the establishment tonight, a powerful punch at the way things have been going.
Or a punch on behalf of the history establishment, the historical idea that there need to be checks and balances, that wonderful idea of the weights resting on each other to make sure no one has unilateral control has been emphasized right now again. It's a Republican administration. It's a Democratic House. It's a tied Senate until we hear further from Montana
and some night,
Virginia.
Maybe not this one, we'll see the fruition of what looked to me tonight as the beginning of the recovery of the Conservative Party by conservative thinking. Pat should be happy.
I leave you with something here. We'll be following up on all this tomorrow on Countdown, obviously, when I return to the set. But in the interim, I'm leaving you a couple of donuts to get through the next couple hours.
They will work.
My final gift to you.
Thank you. Thank you, and goodbye.
And goodbye.
I think we're going to get more involved with the panel as we should. They were a brilliant panel, as you've been seeing all night. It has changed. It has morphed into a group of Nora, fresh as a daisy, Pat Buchanan, ready to fight, Bob Shrum, still hoping for a Kerry recount at this point. It might still be there out there in Ohio. Now that you got rid of Ken Blackwell, who you've been stalking now for 2 years, you finally got rid of him. And John Harwood, a man with hard numbers. John Harwood. We'll be right back with this panel. Let's go right now to my friend David Schuster, who's down by phone. I guess we've lost the camera. We're operating on limited budget now. David, thank you for joining us. You're still down there in Richmond. What do you hear is happening in that Senate race?
Well, Chris, a couple of things. Yeah, we lost the camera at 4:30 in the morning, but no. Come daylight, both Jim Webb and George Allen are going to get a better, at least, picture of where the votes may be that they could be missing. As it stands, the spread now is obviously around 10 or 11,000 votes. Jim Webb with the lead. This is largely the result of absentee ballots that they continue to count through the night. What's going to happen come daylight is both campaigns have lawyers that are going to go across the state and be part of what's known as a canvassing, and that's simply where they will double-check and make sure that the arithmetic was accurate, that the tickers from the electronic voting machines were accurate, that the right numbers were called into the Secretary of the State or the Board of the Elections, and they'll go through and essentially double-check all of the numbers. By the end of the day, at that point, the Webb campaign should have a better idea whether, in fact, there's potential for them to make up the 10 or 11,000 votes. In other words, they may discover that there was a massive computer glitch or that numbers were added incorrectly or that for whatever reason votes were not counted. If that's the case, then obviously that increases the likelihood that once the election is certified 10 days from now, then the Allen campaign would say, yeah, we want to recount, knowing that there's some votes there that could make a big difference. On the other hand, if in this canvassing tomorrow it becomes clear that the official count provided last evening was accurate, that there wasn't some major computer glitch, then it becomes sort of a whole new ball game, a question of, can you figure out some way of making up 10,000 votes if it doesn't appear that those votes exist for you?
Have there been any claims by the Allen campaign that there have been irregularities or failures to count accurately?
No, the Allen campaign now is not sure. I mean, they're just saying, look, we just need to go back and do the canvassing that's warranted under state law and go back and see. But there haven't been any accusations really on either side, Chris, that there was either any major sort of computer glitch or that the math was done improperly or that there was some number that wasn't counted. There is one issue, though, that has come up with both campaigns, and that is apparently a large number of military absentee ballots were either never mailed to military bases or that people who are from Virginia who wanted to vote, who were serving the military for whatever reason, they didn't get their ballots or they weren't faxed properly. So that's a whole
Well,
other
if you
issue.
haven't voted, you can't make a claim to have the right to subsequently vote, can you?
Well, yes and no. You can't, but there's something called a provisional ballot, which, for example, at the polls, if you go to the polls,
Yes,
you're
but
not
they had to have claimed those provisional ballots on Election Day. You must vote on Election Day, right, or earlier?
That's right. You must vote on Election Day. I think the issue is there some sort of issue with provisional ballots, say, at one of the military bases in Virginia? Remember, you're talking about I think 750,000 military veterans and certainly a large number of active duty in Virginia. So there's some question about people who are in active duty military. How did they get their ballots in on Election Day if they did?
Okay, David, I think I can say goodnight to you now, can I?
Yeah, you can say goodnight, and we'll be back up in just a couple of hours.
I think we're going to Morse code next after the phones have failed. But anyway, thank you, David Schuster. You're a great reporter. Here's a look at some notable losers tonight. I'm going to read these boards. It's always brutal, but here we go. Late in the morning now. It's almost 5 o'clock now. Let's take a look at some of these losers. I'm looking down here. I can look up as well. Here they